Have you ever wondered what desperation can drive a person to do? What lines would you cross to save the people you love? In the winter of 1889, in a small town called Millhaven, Alabama, a widow named Eleanor Graves faced that very question. And her answer would change everything. This is the story of how one woman's devotion became a town's damnation, and how worship, when taken to its darkest extreme, can awaken something that should have remained buried forever. Millhaven sat nestled in the hills of northern Alabama, a town of barely 300 souls, where the red clay roads turned to thick mud every time the rains came. The year 1889 had been particularly cruel to Millhaven. The cotton crops had failed for the third consecutive season, the boll weevils having ravaged what little the drought had spared. The railroad that was supposed to bring prosperity had bypassed them entirely, choosing instead to cut through Jasper, 20 miles to the west. People were leaving. Every week, another family would load their belongings onto a wagon and head north toward Tennessee or west, toward Mississippi, anywhere that promised something better than slow starvation. Eleanor Graves stood on the porch of her modest white clapboard house on the edge of town, watching the Hendersons' wagon disappear down the muddy road. She was 34 years old, though the lines around her eyes made her look older. Her husband, Thomas, had died 2 years earlier in a logging accident, crushed beneath a fallen oak tree that had been weakened by disease. She had been left with their house, a small plot of land, and debts that seemed to grow like weeds no matter how hard she worked to pay them down. But Eleanor had something else, something she had inherited from her grandmother, who had come to Alabama from the old country, from a place where people still remembered the ancient ways. In the cellar of her house, hidden beneath loose floorboards, was a leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age, written in a language that looked like English but wasn't quite. Her grandmother had called it the Book of Deep Covenants, and she had warned Eleanor never to open it unless the need was truly desperate. The need, Eleanor decided that cold February morning, had become desperate enough. She had watched her neighbors suffer for too long. She had seen children growing thin, their eyes hollow with hunger. She had attended the funerals of old Mr. Patterson and young Sarah Miller, both taken by a fever that Dr. Blackwood said came from malnutrition and despair. Something had to be done. Someone had to save this town. That night, by candlelight, Eleanor opened the book. The words seemed to writhe on the page, shifting and changing as she tried to focus on them. But slowly, painfully, she began to understand. The book spoke of old gods, entities that existed before churches and crosses, beings that demanded devotion but offered power in return. It spoke of blood sacrifice, of offerings made in secret, of covenants sealed with pain. And it spoke of abundance, of fields that would never fail, of towns that would prosper beyond measure if only someone was willing to pay the price. Eleanor read through the night, her hands trembling, her heart pounding. By the time dawn broke, she had made her decision. The ritual, according to the book, had to be performed at a crossroads at midnight, under a new moon. There was such a crossroads just outside of town, where the old Huntsville Road intersected with the path that led to the abandoned Pritchard farm. Eleanor gathered what she needed: a silver bowl that had belonged to her grandmother, candles made from tallow, herbs she collected from the woods surrounding Millhaven, and a knife with a bone handle. On the night of the new moon, Eleanor walked to the crossroads. The February air was bitter cold, and frost crunched beneath her feet. She could see her breath misting in the darkness. The sky above was cloudless, filled with stars that seemed unnaturally bright, as if they were watching her. She knelt at the center of the crossroads, where the two roads met, and began to arrange the candles in a circle around her. The book had been explicit about the words she needed to speak, the gestures she needed to make. Eleanor followed the instructions precisely, her voice barely above a whisper at first, then growing stronger as she gained confidence. She called out to the entity the book referred to as the Hollow God, an ancient being that existed in the spaces between worlds, feeding on devotion and blood. She offered herself as its servant, its voice in the world of the living. She promised to give it what it craved, in exchange for the prosperity of her town. When the moment came, Eleanor took the bone-handled knife and drew it across her left palm. Blood welled up, dark and thick, and she let it drip into the silver bowl. The pain was sharp, immediate, but she didn't flinch. She poured the blood onto the ground at the crossroads, speaking the final words of the covenant. For a long moment, nothing happened. The night remained still and silent. Then she felt it, a presence vast and cold pressing down on her from somewhere beyond the stars. It wasn't a voice exactly, but she understood its words all the same. The covenant was accepted. The hollow god would feed her town, would bring abundance and prosperity, but it required sustenance in return. It required blood, offered freely and regularly. It required worship. And it required secrecy, for if the covenant was ever broken, if the town ever turned against it, the hollow god would awaken fully, and its hunger would consume everything. Eleanor returned home before dawn, her hand wrapped in cloth to hide the wound. She felt changed, as if something had been hollowed out inside her and filled with something else, something ancient and cold. But she also felt purpose. She had done what needed to be done. Now she would see if the covenant would hold. The changes began within a week. Old Mrs. Henderson, who had been planning to follow her son's family out of town, found a cache of gold coins buried in her garden, coins that had apparently been hidden there during the Civil War and forgotten. The discovery was enough to keep her comfortable for years. Then the Johnson's cow, which had been dry for months, suddenly began producing milk again, rich and abundant. The general store received an unexpected shipment from a supplier in Mobile who had apparently confused Millhaven with another town, but insisted they keep the goods anyway. Within a month, Millhaven began to transform. The changes were small at first, easy to dismiss as coincidence or luck. A traveling merchant came through town and decided to set up a permanent shop, bringing with him goods that hadn't been seen in Millhaven in years. A group of investors from Birmingham arrived, claiming they had heard Millhaven was poised for growth and wanted to buy land for development. Families that had been planning to leave decided to stay, and families that had already left began to return. But Eleanor knew the truth. She could feel the presence of the hollow god growing stronger, could sense its hunger gnawing at the edges of her consciousness. The covenant demanded payment, and she had promised to provide it. The book had been clear. The blood had to come from her, offered willingly and in secret. Every new moon, Eleanor would return to the crossroads and make the offering, cutting her arms, her legs, anywhere she could hide the wounds beneath her clothing. She grew pale and weak, but she told herself it was worth it. The town was thriving. Children were laughing again. The general store was full of customers. Plans were being made to build a new church, a new schoolhouse. Millhaven had been saved, and Eleanor had been the one to save it. But as spring turned to summer, Eleanor realized the offerings were no longer enough. The hollow god's hunger was growing, and her blood alone couldn't satisfy it anymore. She could feel its dissatisfaction, a cold weight pressing down on her mind, demanding more. The book had warned of this, had mentioned that as the god's presence grew stronger, so too would its needs. Eleanor knew what she had to do, but the thought of it made her sick with dread. She chose carefully. There were drifters who passed through town, people no one would miss. The first was a man named Silas Cole, a former Confederate soldier who had been wandering the South for years, working odd jobs and sleeping in barns. Eleanor invited him to her home, offered him a meal and a place to sleep. That night, she drugged his coffee with a tincture made from the herbs described in the book. When he was unconscious, she dragged him to the cellar. The ritual was more complex this time, more visceral. The book instructed her to make the sacrifice at the crossroads, to offer the blood while the victim was still alive, still conscious enough to feel fear. Eleanor followed the instructions with trembling hands, whispering prayers to the hollow god, as Silas Cole's life drained away into the silver bowl. When it was over, she buried the body deep in the woods, in a place where no one would ever find it. The town's prosperity increased tenfold. Within days, a representative from the railroad company arrived, announcing that they were reconsidering their route and might extend a line to Millhaven after all. A bank opened on Main Street. New businesses followed. Millhaven was no longer dying. It was thriving, growing, becoming something more than anyone had imagined possible. Eleanor told herself that she was doing what was necessary. That one life in exchange for the salvation of 300 was a fair trade. She told herself that Silas Cole had been alone in the world, that no one mourned him, that his death had meaning and purpose. But the guilt gnawed at her, and she knew that the hollow god could sense it. The entity's presence in her mind grew stronger, more insistent, as if it was feeding not just on blood, but on her anguish as well. Summer faded into autumn, and Eleanor made 2 more sacrifices. A woman named Martha Finn, a widow like herself who had come to Millhaven looking for work. A teenage boy named Jacob Reed, who had run away from his family in Georgia and was traveling west. Each time Eleanor followed the ritual precisely, and each time the town's prosperity grew. Millhaven was now one of the most successful towns in northern Alabama. The railroad extension was approved, new houses were being built, merchants from as far away as Mobile were setting up shop. But something else was happening, something Eleanor hadn't anticipated. The people of Millhaven were changing. They were becoming more aggressive, more possessive. Neighbors who had once been friendly now eyed each other with suspicion. There were arguments over property lines, over business deals, over trivial slights that would have been laughed off a year earlier. Violence erupted one night when 2 men fought over a card game at the saloon, and one of them ended up dead. The sheriff ruled it self-defense, but Eleanor could see the darkness creeping into the town, could feel the hollow god's influence spreading like poison through Millhaven's veins. She tried to stop. After the 4th sacrifice, a drifter named Thomas Yates, Eleanor decided she couldn't continue. The guilt was too much, the cost too high. She would let the covenant lapse, would accept whatever consequences came. But the hollow god had other plans. That night, as Eleanor lay in bed, she felt the entity's presence overwhelming her, filling her mind with images of what would happen if she broke the covenant. She saw Millhaven burning, saw the ground opening up to swallow the town whole, saw the people she had tried to save torn apart by something vast and terrible. The message was clear. The covenant could not be broken. The hollow god would not release her. She was bound to it now for as long as she lived, and if she stopped feeding it, everyone would die. Eleanor wept, but she knew she had no choice. She had made a bargain, and she would have to keep it no matter the cost to her soul. As winter approached again, almost a year since she had first opened the Book of Deep Covenants, Eleanor looked at her town and saw what she had created. Millhaven was prosperous, yes, but it was also corrupted. The darkness she had invited in couldn't be contained or controlled. It was spreading, changing not just the town's fortunes but its very nature. And Eleanor knew with a certainty that made her blood run cold, that worse was yet to come. The winter of 1890 arrived with unusual severity, bringing snowstorms that buried Millhaven under thick blankets of white. The railroad extension was completed, connecting the town to the larger world beyond the Alabama hills. Trains arrived daily, bringing merchants, investors, and opportunists drawn by stories of Millhaven's miraculous prosperity. The population had nearly doubled in just over a year. A new building seemed to spring up overnight, as if the town itself was growing like some living organism, fed by the hollow god's dark blessing. Eleanor moved through this transformed world like a ghost, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow with sleepless nights and terrible knowledge. She had made 6 more sacrifices since the autumn, each one carefully chosen from the stream of strangers that now flowed through Millhaven. No one noticed the disappearances. In a town full of transients and newcomers, a few missing drifters meant nothing. Eleanor had become efficient at her terrible work, following the rituals with mechanical precision, feeling less human with each passing moon. But something was changing. The hollow god was no longer content to remain hidden in the spaces between worlds. Eleanor could feel it pressing closer to reality, could sense its vast presence pushing against the fabric of existence like something trying to break through thin ice. The offerings were supposed to keep it satisfied, to maintain the barrier between its realm and the physical world. Instead, they seemed to be feeding something larger, something that grew stronger and more present with each sacrifice. The townspeople began to report strange occurrences, shadows that moved independently of their sources, glimpsed from the corners of eyes, whispers in empty rooms, voices speaking in languages no one recognized. Animals behaved oddly, dogs refusing to enter certain buildings, horses bolting in terror from nothing visible. People began having the same dream, a recurring nightmare of standing at a crossroads while something vast and shapeless approached from the darkness beyond the stars. Eleanor knew what was happening. The hollow god was awakening. The covenant had been meant to keep it dormant, to give it just enough sustenance to maintain its gifts, without allowing it to manifest fully in the world. But she had miscalculated, or perhaps the book had lied, or perhaps the hollow god had been planning this from the beginning. Each sacrifice hadn't been feeding it, but summoning it, bringing it closer to the world piece by piece, and now it was almost here. She returned to the Book of Deep Covenants, searching desperately for answers, for some way to reverse what she had done. The pages that had once been difficult to read now seemed to open themselves willingly, the words clear and sharp. She found a section she hadn't noticed before, or perhaps it hadn't been there before. Perhaps the book itself was changing as the hollow god grew stronger. The passage described the final stage of the covenant, when the worshippers' offerings had accumulated enough power for the entity to cross over completely into the physical realm. The hollow god would manifest at the place where the covenant was first made, at the crossroads where Eleanor had offered her blood and spoken the binding words. It would take physical form, shaped by the devotion and fear of those who had unknowingly benefited from its gifts, and once it was fully present in the world, it would no longer need a worshipper to feed it. It would feed itself, consuming everything within reach, starting with the town that had grown fat on its blessings. Eleanor realized with cold horror that she had not saved Millhaven at all. She had simply delayed its destruction, had fattened it like a calf for slaughter, and the awakening was coming soon, perhaps within days. The signs were unmistakable now. The temperature was dropping far below normal for Alabama winters, cold enough to freeze the water in wells. The sky had taken on a strange quality, the blue seeming somehow wrong, as if reality itself was becoming thin. And at night, standing at her window, Eleanor could see lights moving in the distance, dancing across the hills where no lights should be. Eleanor knew she had to act. But what could one person do against an entity as vast as the hollow god? The book offered no solutions, only descriptions of what would happen when the awakening was complete. But there was one passage that gave her a sliver of hope, though it filled her with dread to consider it. The covenant could be ended, the book said, if the one who made it willingly sacrificed themselves at the place where it was forged. Such a death would sever the connection between the hollow god and the world, would slam shut the door that had been gradually opening. But the sacrifice had to be absolute, had to be made with full knowledge and acceptance, and had to include the destruction of the book itself. Eleanor spent a week preparing, putting her affairs in order, without telling anyone what she planned to do. She wrote letters to the few people in town she still considered friends, explaining what she had done and begging their forgiveness. She packed the letters away with instructions that they be opened only after her death. She cleaned her house, settled her debts, and made arrangements for her property to be sold, and the proceeds distributed to the families of those she had killed, if they could ever be identified. But as the date of the new moon approached, the date when the hollow god's awakening would be complete, Eleanor began to doubt her resolve. She had sacrificed so much already, had damned her soul for this town, and now she was expected to give her life as well. Part of her, a dark and bitter part that had grown stronger with each sacrifice, whispered that Millhaven deserved what was coming. The people had accepted the prosperity without questioning its source, had grown greedy and suspicious and cruel. Let them face the hollow god. Let them understand the price of their comfort. But then Eleanor would walk through the town and see the children playing in the snow, innocent and unaware of the doom gathering around them. She would see families preparing for Christmas, decorating their homes and planning celebrations. She would remember why she had made the covenant in the first place, to save these people, to give them a chance at life. The fact that her salvation had turned poisonous didn't change her original intent. 3 days before the new moon, a stranger came to Eleanor's door. He was an old man, bent with age, dressed in clothes that seemed to be from another era. He introduced himself as Samuel Whitmore, a scholar of what he called the old knowledge, and he said he had come to Millhaven because he had sensed a great working of power. He knew what Eleanor had done. He had seen it before in other towns, other times. The hollow god had many names and many servants throughout history, and it always followed the same pattern: promise prosperity, demand blood, awaken and consume. Samuel told Eleanor that her plan to sacrifice herself would work, but only partially. It would close the door and prevent the hollow god from manifesting fully, but the entity's influence would remain, poisoning Millhaven for generations to come. The town would slowly decay, consumed from within by the darkness Eleanor had invited in. Everyone who lived here would be touched by it, would carry a shadow in their souls that would pass to their children and their children's children. The only way to truly end it, Samuel said, was to destroy not just the connection, but the source itself. The source was not the hollow god, which was too vast and ancient to be destroyed by mortal means. The source was the belief, the worship, the accumulated devotion of all those who had unknowingly fed the entity through their prosperity. As long as the people of Millhaven benefited from the hollow god's gifts, as long as they possessed the wealth and success that had been bought with blood, the entity would have a foothold in the world. The town itself had to be destroyed, burned to the ground, reduced to ashes. Only then would the covenant truly end. Eleanor stared at the old man in horror. Destroy the town. Kill everyone she had tried to save. Samuel shook his head sadly. Not kill, he said. Evacuate. Give them a chance to leave, to escape with their lives, if not their possessions. Burn the buildings, the businesses, everything that represented Millhaven's corrupt prosperity. Start over somewhere else, somewhere clean. It was harsh, but it was the only way. Otherwise, the hollow god would awaken, and everyone would die anyway, consumed by an entity that knew only endless hunger. Eleanor spent that night in anguish, torn between impossible choices. She could sacrifice herself and save the people's lives, but condemn them to generations of creeping darkness. Or she could tell them the truth and try to convince them to destroy everything they had built, knowing they would likely refuse to believe her, or worse, turn on her in rage. By dawn, she had made her decision. She would tell the truth. She would give them the choice. And if they refused, if they chose their prosperity over their souls, then at least she would have tried. She started with Reverend Marcus Caldwell, the minister of Millhaven's church. A stern man in his 50s, who had always been suspicious of the town's sudden good fortune. Eleanor told him everything, showed him the Book of Deep Covenants, described the sacrifices she had made and what was coming. She expected him to recoil in horror, to call her a monster and summon the sheriff. Instead, Reverend Caldwell sat in silence for a long time, his face grey, his hands trembling. Finally he spoke. He had known, he said, or at least suspected. The prosperity had felt wrong from the beginning, too perfect, too sudden. He had prayed for guidance, had asked God to show him the truth, and now here it was, worse than he had imagined. But he believed Eleanor. He had seen the signs himself, had felt the presence of something vast and malevolent pressing down on the town, and he agreed that the people needed to know, needed to be given a chance to save themselves. Together, they called a town meeting. It was held in the new town hall, a grand building with marble floors and crystal chandeliers, all paid for with money that had ultimately come from blood and darkness. Nearly everyone in Millhaven attended, curious about what could be so urgent. Eleanor stood before them, her voice shaking but steady, and told them everything. She confessed her crimes. She explained the covenant. She described what would happen when the hollow god awakened in 2 days' time. And she told them what Samuel Whitmore had said, that their only hope was to abandon Millhaven, to destroy the town and start over elsewhere. The reaction was exactly what Eleanor had feared. Some people laughed, thinking it was a joke or a delusion. Others grew angry, accusing her of madness or attempting some kind of elaborate fraud. A few believed her, or at least believed something terrible was happening, but they were in the minority. The town council, a group of wealthy businessmen who had profited most from Millhaven's prosperity, declared that Eleanor Graves was clearly insane and should be locked up for her own safety. They called for a vote to have her committed to an asylum. But before the vote could be taken, the lights in the town hall went out, all of them simultaneously, plunging the building into darkness. And in that darkness, people began to see things, shapes moving in the shadows, forms that were almost human but not quite. The temperature dropped so rapidly that frost formed on the windows in seconds, and everyone, all 300 people crowded into that hall, heard the voice. It wasn't a sound exactly, but a presence in their minds, vast and cold and hungry, speaking in a language that bypassed their ears and went straight to their souls. The hollow god was announcing itself. It was thanking them for their worship, for the devotion they had unknowingly offered through their acceptance of prosperity. It was telling them that the awakening was almost complete, that soon it would walk among them in physical form, and they would all have the honor of feeding it directly. And it was laughing, a sound like mountains grinding together, like the death of stars, at the expression of horror on their faces as they finally understood what Eleanor had been trying to tell them. The lights came back on, the presence faded. But everyone in that hall had felt it, had touched the mind of something ancient and inhuman, and utterly without mercy. There was no more laughter now, no more accusations of madness. Eleanor looked out at the sea of terrified faces and saw belief. They understood now. They knew what was coming. The question was, would they do what was necessary to stop it? The decision was made within hours. Millhaven would be evacuated and destroyed. There was no time for careful planning or lengthy debate. The Hollow God's awakening was scheduled for the new moon, which would rise the following night. Every moment spent in the town increased the danger. Reverend Caldwell organized the exodus with surprising efficiency, directing families to pack only what they could carry and head north toward Jasper. The railroad, ironically, provided the means of escape, with trains hastily arranged to transport people away from the doomed town. By midday, Millhaven was emptying out. Wagons rolled down the muddy streets, loaded with personal possessions and frightened families. Mothers carried crying children. Men led horses laden with whatever goods they could salvage. The scene was chaotic, but purposeful, driven by the shared memory of that terrible presence they had all felt in the town hall. Some people looked back at their homes with anguish, mourning the loss of everything they had built. Others couldn't leave fast enough, eager to put distance between themselves and the entity that waited at the crossroads. Eleanor worked alongside Samuel Whitmore and a group of volunteers to prepare the town for its destruction. They moved through the empty buildings, gathering anything flammable, dousing structures with kerosene. The plan was simple and brutal. Once everyone was safely away, they would set fires at strategic points throughout Millhaven. The entire town would burn. Every building that represented the corrupt prosperity, every structure bought with blood money, would be reduced to ash. Only then would the Hollow God's hold on this place be broken. As evening approached, the last of the townspeople departed. Only a handful remained: Eleanor, Samuel, Reverend Caldwell, and 3 other volunteers who had chosen to stay behind and help with the burning. They stood in the center of what had been Millhaven's bustling main street, now empty and silent, and prepared to destroy it. Eleanor held the Book of Deep Covenants in her hands, wrapped in oil-soaked cloth. It would be the first thing to burn, she had decided. The source of all this suffering had to be eliminated completely. But before they could begin, they felt it. The presence returning, stronger than before, pressing down on them with suffocating weight. The sun had set, and the new moon was rising, invisible in the sky. At the crossroads outside of town, where Eleanor had first made her covenant, something was beginning to manifest. They could see lights gathering there, cold and pale, swirling in patterns that hurt to look at. The air itself seemed to crack and split, reality tearing like fabric, and through the tears they could see something vast and terrible beginning to emerge. The Hollow God was awakening ahead of schedule, responding to the threat of the town's destruction. If it could manifest fully before Millhaven burned, it could prevent the fires, could preserve its foothold in the world. Eleanor realized with cold certainty that someone needed to go to the crossroads, needed to hold the Hollow God's attention while the others started the fires. And there was only one person it would focus on, only one person whose presence it would find impossible to ignore, the one who had made the covenant in the first place. Eleanor ran toward the crossroads, clutching the book to her chest. Behind her, she heard Reverend Caldwell shouting, heard the others beginning their grim work of setting Millhaven ablaze. She didn't look back. She focused only on reaching that terrible place where light and darkness swirled together, where reality was tearing itself apart to allow something ancient and hungry to enter the world. She could feel the hollow god's attention turning toward her, could sense its rage at her betrayal, at her attempt to end the covenant it had spent a year cultivating. When she reached the crossroads, Eleanor stopped and held the book high. The entity's presence was overwhelming here, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. She could see it now, or at least the suggestion of it, a shape that was constantly shifting, impossible to focus on, vast beyond comprehension. It had no face, but she felt it looking at her, felt its fury and its hunger and its terrible alien intelligence. Eleanor opened the book to its final page, where the original words of the covenant were written, and she began to speak. But she wasn't reciting the covenant, she was renouncing it. Word by word, she took back every promise she had made, rejected every bargain, denied the hollow god any claim on her soul or her town. The entity shrieked, a sound that wasn't sound, but pure psychic force, and reality around her began to fracture further. Behind her, Eleanor could see flames rising from Millhaven, could smell the smoke as the town began to burn. She kept speaking, kept renouncing, even as the hollow god's manifestation grew more solid, more present. With the last word spoken, Eleanor threw the Book of Deep Covenants into the silver bowl she had brought with her, the same bowl she had used for her offerings. She struck a match, her hands steady despite everything, and dropped it into the bowl. The book erupted into flames that burned far hotter and brighter than any normal fire, flames that seemed to burn reality itself. The hollow god's scream intensified, its partially manifested form beginning to destabilize. Eleanor stood at the center of the crossroads, surrounded by flames both mundane and supernatural, and watched as the entity she had awakened was forced back through the tears in reality, back into the spaces between worlds where it belonged. The flames consumed her along with the book. Eleanor Graves died at the crossroads, where she had made her terrible bargain, her sacrifice closing the door she had opened, severing the hollow god's connection to the world. Behind her, Millhaven burned throughout the night, every building reduced to ash and rubble. By dawn, nothing remained of the town that had thrived on blood and darkness. The survivors, gathered in Jasper, would eventually disperse throughout Alabama and beyond, carrying with them the memory of what had happened and a hard-learned lesson about the cost of prosperity bought with corruption. And at the crossroads outside of what had once been Millhaven, a marker was eventually placed, warning travelers away from a place where reality had been torn and imperfectly mended, where something vast and hungry still waited in the darkness beyond the stars, patient and eternal, hoping that someday someone would make another covenant and invite it back into the world once more. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.